Ruthless Compassion is a podcast that shows you how to become fiercely kind. I'm the host, Dr. Marcia Sirota, and in each episode, I get into it with experts and regular folks about the things that get in the way of what we want. Things like addiction and mental health, isolation and loneliness, difficult family and work relationships, and the importance of self-care. I want to help you overcome the obstacles to living your best life, and I want to inspire you to become a powerful kindness warrior. Dr. Ryan Martin teaches courses on mental illness and emotion, including a course on anger. His website, All the Rage, covers recent research on anger and provides anger management tips on how to handle anger most effectively. He also hosts the popular psychology podcast, Psychology and Stuff. Ryan was trained as a counseling psychologist at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he first started studying anger after earning his undergraduate degree in psychology with a minor in criminal justice from the University of St. Thomas. He has worked with clients, angry and otherwise, in a variety of settings, including community mental health centers, college counseling centers, and a VA hospital. He is a professor of psychology and an associate dean for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. His work has been featured in the New York Times, NPR's Invisibilia podcast, BBC Radio's Digital Human, TED.com, and elsewhere. When he's not thinking about feelings, he runs and spends time with his family. Welcome, Ryan Martin, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here today because I think the thing that you study, anger, is such a fascinating and misunderstood topic. First of all, I just wanted to have you kind of introduce yourself and tell the listeners what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Ryan Martin. I'm a professor of psychology and the associate dean for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. But most importantly for today, I'm an anger researcher. So I've been spending about the last truly 20 or so years, maybe even longer, studying anger in various ways. Actually, since I started graduate school in '99, I've been studying why people get mad and how they express it, the types of thoughts they have, and that sort of thing.
So the first question that comes to my mind is, why did you think that anger was such an interesting topic to study?
Yeah, so like most psychologists, my passion for what I study comes from some childhood experiences and things like that. I was raised in a family that I think sort of in some ways tongue-in-cheek, people referred to the Martin temper and talked about, especially the male members of my family having anger issues, things like that. And so I spent a lot of my childhood, especially with my father, kind of asking the same questions I ask now, which is, well, is that person mad? Why are they mad? Is there something I can do to make them less mad? And, that extended into, I think, my college years when I found myself really, really intrigued by, I worked at a shelter for at-risk adolescents in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And I found myself really noticing a lot that there were kids in the shelter who struggled controlling their anger. I think it's fair to point out, and I don't know that I knew this at the time, but many of those kids had a lot to be angry about. The world had not been terribly fair to them. But what was often getting them into trouble was their difficulty controlling their anger. And that resonated with me because I'd had similar problems, I think, when I was an adolescent. And I've just found myself really fascinated by this topic and went on to graduate school with the desire of exploring that. I don't think I knew at the time how much of my life I would spend studying it, but that was my goal when I started graduate school.
Nothing like a personal passion to drive a vocation.
Right.
Well, so the next question that kind of leads from that is, so why do people get mad?
Yeah, so it's, most people would say that's a really simple question. I actually think it's a really complicated, fascinating one. But, most people would point to just provocations. They would say, well, I get mad because, people are messing with me or because people are slowing me down or whatever. And there's certainly some truth to that. But people get angry. It has a lot to do with the provocation itself, the thing that happened to them. But it also has to do with their interpretation of that thing. And so it has to do with, when something happens to you, how do you perceive it? How do you make sense of it? as a general rule, people get angry in these situations that they perceive as being, unpleasant and blameworthy and caused by someone else. They get even more angry in these situations where they feel like it's out of control and that they just can't cope with it. So when they see they're slowed down, for example, and then they say, oh, this is going to ruin my entire day, then that thing that slowed them down becomes that much more anger provoking. It's very different than if you were to perceive that or experience that and say, it's going to slow me down. It's not a big deal. I got plenty of time. And so that perception really ends up driving our tendency to get angry. And then,
yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Carry on.
I was going to say another element of this has to do with what we call the pre-anger state.
That was what I was just going to ask you about.
Perfect. Yeah, and that's the mood we're in at the time of that provocation or that negative thing. And so if I'm tired, if I'm stressed, if I'm hungry, all of those kind of elements, even if I'm physically uncomfortable, all of those things tend to exacerbate our response to the provocation. And part of it has to do with just they make it that much harder to cope or that much harder to control our impulses.
And is there a particular type of thing that provokes anger more than others, or is it depending on the person?
It's going to depend on the person a little bit, but there are some standards that we see. And one of those is what we would call goal blocking. And so if a person has a goal in mind, a thing they're trying to accomplish, then anything that interferes with achieving that goal is likely to lead to anger. And I should say I define goal broadly, because a goal could be, I need to finish this paper I'm writing. A goal could be, I need to get to the grocery store so I can get home in time for my show or whatever. So anything that interferes with that could be, it could be something like, well, I'm trying to print out the paper and the printer doesn't work, right? So that's blocking your goal. Or I'm trying to walk over to the computer lab, but people are walking too slowly in the hallway, or things like that. I keep hitting red lights. That sort of goal blocking tends to really lead to frustration. And we actually study that or have studied that in, infants and in animals, this idea that even with infants, you can put an object just out of their reach or behind glass and something that they want, and you'll see frustration ensue. You'll see crying, maybe even pounding their fists and things like that to let you know, hey, this isn't fair. I don't like this.
So that makes me think about, the difference between a baby and an adult, because I'm just imagining a situation in which a grown-up who had a lot of frustration when they were younger would be more sensitive to this idea of goal blocking, whereas an adult who either didn't have as much frustration or who learned how to cope with frustration and trust the universe or trust themselves that they would still find a way to achieve their goal might not be as angry. Have you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, there are structures in the brain that develop over time and that we get better at using. And so, at its core, anger is the emotional desire to lash out, right? So when you are wronged, one of your instincts is to lash out either physically or verbally at the thing that wronged you. And as we get older and as we develop and mature, we become better at controlling those impulses. And so, or at least we should get better at controlling those impulses. And so, when you think about, the difference between, an infant and a toddler and an adolescent and an adult is that capacity to control and channel those frustrations into maybe something more adaptive or something problem solving increases over time.
Right. And that's what we hope for, but that doesn't necessarily happen, right?
No, it doesn't. And that becomes the, part of that is just it's practice and it's modeling. And it's, one of the golden rules of, I think, emotional development is that we tend to express emotion the way it was modeled for us by our caregivers. So, often our parents, but not just our parents. And so if our parents yell and scream when they're angry, then we are more likely to yell and scream when we're angry. If our parents or caregivers turn to physical violence, then we are more likely to do that. And so a big part of it is that. In some ways, that brings us back to that pre-anger state part, that because when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're all those things, when we're stressed, it makes it harder for us to actually control some of those emotional impulses, that we just see less activity in the structures of the brain involved in that. And so we're more likely to, another biggie here is sleep deprivation. We're just more likely to lash out at people when we're tired because it's harder to control those impulses.
So yeah, the frontal lobe is compromised by all these stress states, right?
Yep, exactly.
So, okay, I want to play a little devil's advocate with you because I've been a psychotherapist for 100 years or so, and feels like that sometimes. And but I worked mainly with women.
Okay.
And what I have found is slightly different than what you were saying about how if you're raised by angry people, you're going to be more angry. Because what I have found with my female patients, and I don't know if I'm overgeneralizing around women versus men, but this has been my experience for several decades, which is that if a woman grows up with a lot of expressed anger and aggression, often she will have a fear of expressing her own anger because she perceives the people being angry as so awful that she says to herself deep down inside and on some kind of unconscious level, I'm not going to be like that. I'm never going to be like that. So she represses her anger and never even knows that she feels angry, let alone expresses it. And sometimes also with my female patients who've lived, grown up with a lot of anger, they will have so much anger and they're so afraid that they will become abusive with their anger that they just completely shut it down because they actually have a deep urge to lash out and they feel that urge consciously and they get freaked out. And so it gets suppressed. Have you had that kind of experience in your studies?
I have, and I would agree with that point fully. And I might even add one other element here, which is that I think society is, not just society, but, even more specifically parents, they're far less forgiving of girls and women's anger than they are boys and males' anger, at least in the United States and I believe elsewhere. And so I think, from a modeling perspective, and maybe it's not necessarily parents in this case, but more broadly, girls who express their anger, especially in a physical way, receive punishments that I think boys and men don't necessarily receive. And sometimes I think not necessarily, I think just the messages, the cultural messages surrounding violence and aggression that way are discouraged more. And so I think that, oftentimes girls end up being punished in these other ways that makes it hard for them to, and I don't want to generalize too much, but makes it hard for them to express their anger that way. I think that's very fair and very true.
Yeah, I think you're right about the cultural bias, and it's an interesting question to ask why that might be, but I guess that's another conversation, huh? But so I had another thought as you were talking, which is the connection between shame and anger, because I have seen some male patients who had a lot of deep shame, and the way they expressed their shame was through anger. Is that something that you've seen at all?
Yeah, I think for some people, and I would say shame, but I would just expand it to a lot of other emotions. I think for a lot of people, anger feels a lot safer to them than sadness or shame or guilt. And I've seen this in former clients. I've seen this in participants. This idea that, well, it's easier for me to blame other people than it is to actually own my own responsibility here. And so they end up feeling anger towards the people around them instead of, for example, let's just use something as simple as driving. You're on your way someplace and you're slowed down to the point that you're going to be late to whatever it is. Now, there's infinite ways to appraise that situation, but you can think about, you can blame the people around you who are slowing you down. You can blame the stoplights, or you can say to yourself, well, I should have left 5 minutes earlier, or I should have left 10 minutes earlier. And, it's safer and easier for many people to kind of pin that blame on the world around them than it is to actually own their own kind of responsibility in that. And I think that's, that's a thing that many people deal with is this sense of kind of, it's hard for people to own their role in some of this. And so therefore they're more likely to experience anger.
For sure. Here's another question that came up when you were talking. So yeah, I just keep thinking of interesting things to ask you because this is such a cool topic. So sometimes my patients say that they get this kind of rush when they do something. And I'm just wondering if people can get like a little rush in their brain, like a little rush of dopamine or adrenaline or endorphins that make them feel really good when they express anger, when they lash out, when they explode, and that they might kind of get some kind of addictive cycle going on around exploding, getting a rush of these neurochemicals, and then exploding again because they get kind of hooked on the rush.
Yeah, I think that on some level, what we see is, anger, really emotions in general, but I think anger very specifically, part of what it does is it alerts us to injustice, right? So it's one way that our brain conveys to us that we've been wronged or treated unfairly. But then the second piece is that it encourages us or it energizes us, I should say, to confront that injustice. And so it gives us the energy via frankly, the fight or flight system, the same system that kicks in when we're scared. And it energizes us to do something about it. So I do think we feel that rush. And I do, and this is an area that I personally haven't explored in a lot of detail. I do think there's something really fascinating about human beings enjoying, breaking things, right? Mm-hmm. And so we see, and I should start by saying that, these rage rooms, I do not believe the research would tell us that rage rooms and things like that are not good for people, that kind of catharsis is just simply bad for human beings. However, I do think that the reason people like them is because it feels good in the moment. And so it's a topic I'm interested in is where does this love of destroying things come from? Why do people like breaking stuff? Why do they like demolition? I think that's an interesting question, but it does seem like it gives people a little bit of I don't want to use the word high in a substance related sense, but this kind of feeling of excitement.
Yeah, so you might want to do a little research down the road on whether the dopamine levels in the brain go up with being destructive in the same way as they might go up when people are eating sugar.
Right.
That might be interesting. Yeah,
it would.
So I just watched your TED Talk the other day, and I highly recommend it to people. It's very, very interesting. In your talk, you talk about how we make sense of things around our anger, and you use these two, primary and secondary appraisal, these phrases, and I just wanted you to explain what that means and in the context of anger.
Yeah, so if people can imagine, something happened to them. Well, I'm just going to use the driving example because it's one that I think a lot of people can relate to. But you're driving along and someone in front of you is driving slower than the speed limit. The two types of appraisal that happen in that moment. The first is primary, and that's where you're evaluating the person's behavior itself, right? So you're saying to this person, you're saying about this person, well, they shouldn't do that. This is wrong. And you're evaluating the act and trying to make sense of it. And some of that is even going to be, why are they doing this? Are they doing this on purpose? Are they doing this to bother me? Whatever. So there's that. That's primary appraisal. You evaluate the person or the act. And then secondary is where you evaluate your ability to cope with it. And so, they in some ways, these two things kind of happen simultaneously. So even though we're talking about them separately, they're both essentially happening kind of at the same time. But that's where you're really asking, how big a deal is this? And if you're saying, well, this is going to ruin my entire day or my entire life, or I'm going to be late to all my meetings or whatever, then you're more likely to get angry than if you say, well, it's not a big deal, right? I'm going to be a little bit late to work or, whatever. Then you're not going to get as angry. So part of why this is important is that you can think that another person's behavior is wildly inappropriate and you might get a little angry, but if it doesn't have much of an effect on you or you feel like you'll have no difficulty coping with it, then you're not going to get as angry as you otherwise would.
So I think what we're saying is that if you have more faith in yourself, more trust in yourself, more confidence in your coping strategies, that even if you see someone behaving really badly, you're not going to necessarily want to lash out because you will have resources within yourself to deal with it.
Exactly. And so this is where, and you can think about this in those kind of big instances. You can think about this in terms of small things. Like, if I print something to a printer and it doesn't work, but I have access to another printer or I have the skills to, solve this problem, it feels like it's a very different experience than if I look at this and I think, oh, great, now I can't, I'm on my way to this meeting and I can't get this thing printed out or whatever. So, our ability to problem solve, our ability to kind of think creatively and to address those issues ends up decreasing anger because we know that we have alternative options. And this might also speak to a question you asked earlier about, adolescents and about kids. Sometimes they just don't have necessarily those resources because they don't know what's available. So if something doesn't work and they don't have an easy solution in mind, they might become kind of devastated. Like, oh, now this means I'm not going to be able to watch my favorite show, or it means I'm not going to be able to do whatever, or, my birthday party is ruined, or whatever, because they don't necessarily know what those alternatives are.
And it brings to mind this concept of learned helplessness. So
yes,
it's not just having the problem solving abilities and those coping strategies. It's also believing that they're available, because I know that I have patients who I see in psychotherapy who are excellent problem solvers, but in the moment, they forget that for many years they've been great problem solvers. And in that particular moment, their mind goes blank and they feel completely overwhelmed. So I think that if you have that learned helplessness, even if you have coping strategies, because you don't necessarily remember that you have them, you can get upset.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways, yeah, I completely agree. And in some ways, I'd say that stuff can be sort of mood specific. That there are times when, even just me personally, I feel like, oh yeah, this is easily solved. And then there are other times where I think, I don't want to deal with this right now. Right now, even if it is easy, I'm exhausted, I'm tired. I don't want this problem in my life. And so it feels like even if I have the capacity to solve it, it's easier to become overwhelmed by it in those instances and leads to greater anger.
Yeah, I call that throwing yourself off the cliff.
Yes.
You're making a choice to fling yourself into that feeling rather than kind of stopping and going, do I really want to go over the cliff?
Yep. That is exactly right.
All right. Well, there's something you also talk about, which I think is really interesting. It's a little complicated, so I know you're going to break it down for the listeners, and it's called inflammatory labeling and things that make your anger worse. Can you talk about the different aspects of inflammatory labeling and why that's important for us to know about?
Yeah. So, to back up a moment and talk about in the context. So we have these thought types that we know tend to exacerbate anger when people experience them. And so basically, when you get mad, and part of that appraisal process is that sometimes people do things like catastrophize. Sometimes they have these really demanding thoughts. So sometimes they blame the wrong people for things. Inflammatory labeling, though, is particularly interesting because we see that it's very common compared to the other types of thoughts. And really what it is that when a bad thing happens, we tend to label either the thing itself, but more often the person that we think is responsible for it in these really negative, inflammatory ways. So we describe them as, lots of words I probably shouldn't say right now, but we describe them as, an idiot, a complete fool, a complete loser, a dummy, or whatever. And what happens is that because when we do that, we stop responding and thinking about that person as an individual, and we start thinking of them as the label we gave them. And so if I decide that one of my coworkers is a complete screw up, I now stop thinking about their positive qualities. I am no longer thinking about the times they've done great things or done things correctly. And I'm thinking more about, them as a screw up and the failures along the way. This is easier for us to do when we don't know the person very well. And so one of the most common places for this, I think, is when we're driving, because we're surrounded by these anonymous others, and it's easy to label them in a negative way when you don't know anything else about them. And then we start responding to this idiot instead of the human being in the car in front of us.
For sure, for sure. And there's one part of inflammatory labeling that I think is really interesting, which is catastrophizing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so catastrophizing is this really has a lot to do with that coping piece that I've been talking about, the secondary appraisal. Catastrophizing is when we essentially blow the bad things happen out of the water, and we just say, "Oh, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. This is terrible." And so we blow things up to be much, much more significant than they actually are. And so, I'll use I have a tendency actually to do this in the morning. I have 2 children. They are sometimes harder to get out the door in the morning than I wish they were. And so when I'm taking them to school, there are times where I I catastrophize a little bit the consequences of how long it takes them to put their shoes on as we get out the door. And so I make this thing much bigger than it actually is, when ultimately, the delay might be 4 or 5 minutes. In my head, it's, come on, guys, I got to get to work. We got to do this. And I make this thing much worse than it actually is. Catastrophizing is associated with all sorts of anger problems. It's actually associated with all sorts of other negative emotions too, depression and sadness and fear and other feeling states.
So basically not a good habit to have.
No, I oftentimes encourage people to really try and take a moment when you're faced with some sort of negative event and actually think through, to the best that we can, the true and reasonable consequences of what happened. So what does it actually mean that you were stopped by this train? What does it mean that the person in front of you is walking slower than you want them to? What does it mean? We haven't talked so much yet about being treated unfairly or perceiving that. What does it mean that this person was disrespectful to you? Because sometimes we say, "Oh, this is the worst, and now I'm going to be super late," when really what it means is, I'm going to be 5 minutes later than I hoped to, and that's not going to ruin my whole day.
Yeah, I ask my patients, what's the worst possible thing that can happen in this situation? And if it's not that bad, why are you catastrophizing?
Yep, exactly.
All right. Well, you brought up this trigger for anger about being treated unfairly. So why don't you talk about how that, stirs up anger in people?
Yeah. So much of what we've been talking about so far has been the goal blocking side of anger. And this is going to be related to that, of course. But another reason why people often get angry is when they believe that they're not getting the respect they deserve, or they believe that they are not being treated fairly, or I should add, like, other people that they care about aren't being treated fairly, is another reason why people will sometimes get angry. And so it's a similar mechanism as far as why people get mad here, as we'll see with the goal blocking piece, that there's this sense of, well, I deserve something different, and they're not respecting me as a person. They're not respecting my work. So there's still that appraisal piece that is relevant there. One of the differences, though, is that I think some ways people internalize this a little bit more than they do the goal blocking thing, where the goal blocking element is, well, I'm trying to accomplish something and things are interfering. This is more internalized. It takes a toll on them and their esteem.
Right. They take it personally.
Yep, exactly.
And is there different ways that people get angry when they have goal blocking as opposed to when they're feeling a perceived injustice, or is it kind of the same anger that comes out either way?
I think it's oftentimes the same anger that comes out the same way. I think, so much of it is kind of where is it directed and who is the source. And I think sometimes the being treated unfairly piece, it happens a little bit more in some of those interpersonal situations, because it might be someone that whose opinion you actually care about, right? So it might be a spouse, it might be a boss, or a friend, or a family member in that way. And so sometimes it does feel a little more personal when you're treated that way. But by and large, the rest of those mechanisms are pretty similar.
And, we are talking for quite a while now about, all the sort of negative aspects of anger, but in your TED Talk and in your work, you say that anger is really a good thing and that everyone should have anger, just they should have it in the right way. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, why anger is good and how to have anger in the right way, in a beneficial way.
Yeah. So I argue, and this is, that all emotions exist in us because they offered our ancestors this evolutionary advantage. And so, sadness alerts us to loss, and fear alerts us to danger, and anger alerts us to this injustice, and it energizes us to confront that injustice. And so I think of emotions as really these motivators in a way that is similar. It's different, but in a way that is similar to the same way, feeling thirsty encourages me to get a drink of water. Feeling angry encourages me to respond to that injustice. Now, where people oftentimes go wrong is how they respond to those injustices, right? Because it isn't often a good idea to respond aggressively or with hostility or to be combative. But we can, as human beings, we have the potential to take that anger and maybe channel it into other things and use that energy to channel or to accomplish other things. And so maybe it's protesting, or maybe it's asserting ourselves in an appropriate way, or maybe it's writing letters to the editor. I am not an artist, but I have many friends who are, and those, they talk about the value of anger in their work, whether it's, poetry or writing or sculpting or painting, that we can channel our anger into these meaningful experiences that can make it actually a productive emotion. And so, you can think of it similarly. When people are sad, that sadness encourages them to replace the loss that they have felt. And so when they get sad, it's a way of saying, okay, there must be something missing from my life. What can I replace this thing? Can I find this thing? When people are scared, they say, well, there must be something dangerous. And so they can try and flee from that danger or make sure they are safe. When they're angry, they can use that anger to deal with and energize them to confront those injustices.
That's really nicely said. So the question that comes to mind is there any place for yelling and screaming at somebody? Is there any good reason for somebody to stand there and, shout at another person?
That's hard. I know I'm stalling here a little bit.
I know it's a hard question.
Yeah. Well, let me say this. I in my life, I'm not going to pretend for a second that I've never yelled or screamed at anyone. However, I try really hard not to. As a general rule, I don't want to treat other people that way. That said, I'm also reluctant to use words like never or always, because life is complicated and nuanced. And so maybe there are times where, whether it's to protect yourself or to protect people, you feel the need to be aggressive or hostile or things like that. So I'm reluctant to use the word never. However, I think as a general rule, we should try and be more reasonable in our way of interacting.
Yeah, I mean, that was a little bit of a trick question. You know that because from what I totally agree with your answer, because from what I see, it's like if you want to express your anger constructively, you got to build a bridge. You can't just start yelling at somebody because they're going to shut down, they're going to get defensive, or they're going to get aggressive themselves. Whereas if you say, hey, what you did, that made me angry, can we talk about it? Then you can actually do something constructive with it. So, but I absolutely agree that when you have to defend yourself or defend somebody else from harm, then maybe a little more aggression might be in order. But again, you have to be strategic about it. Maybe you don't ever want to do that with your boss.
Right.
Not appropriate. Yeah. So you talk about regulating emotions around anger, and you think you've said enough about that, or is there anything else you want to add about regulating emotions?
For me, what I would love for people to take from any talk I do or anytime I have a chance to reach people is to, when they are provoked or when they feel provoked or when they feel angry, to ask themselves really the question, why am I mad right now? And I hope and like to believe that, especially with practice, people can develop the insight into themselves and their experiences to have a sense for why they're feeling what they're feeling and to know what part is on them, what they're bringing to the table, to know what part is being caused by other people, to understand and be thoughtful about, things like the mood they're in and whether or not that influences things. And then to have, I think, the insight and the ability into how to express it or how to manage it to get where they need to go. I think that's what people should be kind of shooting for. And I wouldn't say that just with anger, I'd say it with all emotions, to really try and get to the core of why people are feeling a certain way and what they can do about it. And that takes a lot of effort. People have to be thoughtful and they have to practice and work on it. But I think that's where people can have just the most healthy emotional life.
Sounds good to me. To wrap up, I wanted to ask you just a few ending questions. And the first one is, what projects are you working on these days that people might be interested in finding out more about?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been really interested in, and I'm working on some research related to, is avoidance specifically. So the concept of avoidance. And avoidance is complicated in the world of anger because sometimes avoidance looks a lot like suppression. It's when I get mad, I shut down and I go sit in my room and pout and, cry, or I deny it and I say, everything's fine, I'm fine.
Or you drink, that's some of my patients do that.
Yep, exactly. And that isn't a real healthy way to deal with anger most of the time. However, sometimes avoidance is a little different because sometimes avoidance is actually a smart approach in that it's I need to take some time to reflect on this. I need to have some space to kind of get away from the things that are angering me and maybe approach them differently. So avoidance ends up being very contextual, I think more so than a lot of other types of responses to anger. So I've really become intrigued in that and how and why people use avoidance when it's a valuable approach and when it's not. So I've been working on some research related to that.
And have you published anything yet for people to look at, or will you be?
I have an article where avoidance, it's funny you mention it because there was an article I published, and I don't actually remember when, but actually probably 4 or 5 years ago, that had avoidance. It's kind of where I discovered that avoidance was complicated this way, that it wasn't behaving the way people thought it would behave as far as variables go. And so that's the study I'm actually following up on right now with another research project where we look just much more specifically at the different types of avoidance that exist. So that's the paper I'm currently writing.
Would people be able to find that on your website, or would it be in a journal? How would they find that?
So you'd be able to find the work about avoidance. So my website is alltheragescience.com. You'd be able to find that article on the website, or at least a link to it. And then the article that I'm working on hopefully would be published sometime in the next year. I also just have an article coming out in a journal called The Teaching of Psychology that I'm actually really excited about because it'll be out, I think, in the next month or two. But it's really about how teachers of psychology should talk about anger in their courses. Anger is, I think, underrepresented in college courses related to psychology. And a lot of that has to do with its absence from our diagnostic and statistical manuals and things like that, or its relative absence, I should say. And so I just wrote an article about how teachers should be teaching about it that comes out in the next month or so.
That's so important. I absolutely agree with you. I remember when I was first a psychotherapist, brand new, and I was doing some supervision, and we were talking about how to deal with people who are angry, and understood that nothing was taught when I was in my training, all those years and years of training, but still hardly anything was taught about how to deal with people's anger.
Right.
So that's great. So before we end, maybe you could give the listeners a call to action based on all the things we've been talking about today.
It's going to be another version of something I said a moment ago, but I would love, I think, and thank you for posting the website link. I think that there's a lot of information there for people who want to have a healthier emotional life and anger life, I guess I'd say. I think All the Rage Science is a good resource for people. One of the things I would say, though, is really truly self-reflection and searching for personal insight is so important when it comes to all of our emotions, but especially anger, that really taking time to ask ourselves those questions when we are feeling angry, I think can go a long way. So my call to action would be to really take the time to ask yourself those questions and reflect on those things, and to the best that you can, be honest with yourself, because I think that's the way that you will start to feel better.
And can I add a little call to action on top
Please.
of yours?
Yes.
Is when you get angry about injustices in the world, use that energy and do something positive with it.
Yes, I would fully and completely agree.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for talking with me today, Ryan. It's been really, really interesting, and I think so important, this discussion. I think it's not talked about enough, and I really appreciate that you're doing this great work on anger.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me.
That was the fascinating Dr. Ryan Martin, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you liked this podcast, please review it on iTunes, and you can sign up for my free monthly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online courses.